I'm sure all of you have heard about or know about or read about the Union Carbide disaster in Bhopal, which is the worst industrial disaster in history. I don't know how many of you know that it is still ongoing, that people are still dying, that of the 500,000 people who were exposed to the toxic gases on a night 28 years, almost 28 years ago, about 1/5 are still battling chronic illnesses of the lungs, of the brain, of the reproductive system, of the musculoskeletal system, of a host of mental health problems. And I'm sure most of you do not know that there's another disaster that's also ongoing, and that's the disaster caused by the reckless dumping of hazardous waste by Union Carbide Corporation in and around the factory. And both of these disasters, as I said, the gas disaster has killed about 25,000 people, about 120 to 150,000 people still battling chronic illnesses, and there are over 60,000 people who have been exposed, chronically exposed to a cocktail of a whole host of organochlorines and heavy metals and pesticides in their local groundwater, which has been the only source of drinking water for them. And there is also abundant evidence to show that it was because of deliberate acts of omission and commission by Union Carbide Corporation, that which owned and designed, operated and supervised the factory in Bhopal, that these are, in fact, this was not an accident, but these were corporate crimes that continue to be perpetrated in Bhopal on the people there. And also there is abundant evidence to show that the government of India and the state government, which is the government of Madhya Pradesh, actually have protected the business interests of these corporations over the interests of the people who elected them. And this has been irrespective of the political party in power, that the government has all along helped the corporation. In fact, the first response of the government to the gas disaster was not telling people to run in the opposite direction of the wind or to cover their noses and mouth with wet cloth, which would have protected them and maybe protected thousands of people. In fact, the first response of the government was to rush with vehicles, lift dead bodies and dump them into the river and the forest to bring down the number of dead. And this continues. This act of this complicity of the elected government continues till this day. Now about the health concerns, if you see it right from the time of the disaster, in fact, when the disaster was still occurring, when the gases were still leaking, thousands of people reached the one big government hospital that was there. They reached there, the doctors didn't know what to do. They found people breathless and coughing and moaning and groaning and dying right at the hospital doorstep. And so these doctors called up the plant medical officer, and all he said was, this is just like a potent tear gas. You wash with water and it will go. Of course, it was a lie. But this lie kept on getting repeated, including by Jackson Browning, who was the director of environmental and health in the company. And immediately after the disaster, what also started was Union Carbide's downplaying of the consequences. It's interesting to note that Dr. Hans Wheel, who was the doctor who actually was reprimanded by the US courts for fudging the x-rays of asbestosis victims to show that asbestos didn't cause any problem, the same Dr. Hans Wheel came as an Union Carbide expert to Bhopal right after the disaster to say that it's not such a problem. People are actually improving 1 week after the disaster. The third thing, which is, everywhere I speak, people find this the most reprehensible. And this is, right after the disaster, we had a German doctor from Max Planck Institute for Toxicology, Dr. Max Donderer, and he came and he found that if you give IV intravenous sodium thiosulfate, it increases the thiocyanate content of your urine, which means that sodium thiosulfate was somehow, so to speak, detoxifying people's bodies. And in fact, he recorded, and we recorded because we also did it, a significant improvement in the situation of the victims. They were eating better, they were breathing better, they were less fatigued, and yet Union Carbide actively stopped this drug from being administered, because the Director General of Health Services in the state was the younger brother of Union Carbide security chief. He circulated a note saying whichever doctor gives this drug has to defend himself or herself, because we don't know what this drug can do. The drug did nothing that was actually other than the relief in symptoms. The other unpardonable thing is the withholding of information. We know that Union Carbide carried out studies on the effect of MIC, methyl isocyanate, the gas that leaked, on living systems at the Carnegie Mellon Institute in the University of Pittsburgh for 7 to 10 years. And yet it still continues to withhold medical information on the leaked gases, claiming that these are trade secrets. As a result, as you can imagine, doctors say, we don't know what gas it was, we don't know how to treat, so there has been rampant abuse of antibiotics and steroids and psychotropic drugs and painkillers over the years. So symptomatic treatment has been the mainstay of the medical response in the face of Union Carbide withholding medical information. And I mean, I do not know how many of you know, but the compensation that Union Carbide paid was $500 to 94% of the people exposed for lifelong injuries, and $2,000 for every death that occurred. Which this meant, and given the fact that majority, 72% of the people who were exposed were actually people who were dependent on hard physical labor for their livelihood, which meant there was starvation in thousands of families, because they got so little compensation and they had borrowed so much for medical treatment. And the other kind of, apart from withholding this medical information, there was also active suppression of information. Like, we've got these corporate records, and all of which I'm saying, for all of these. In fact, I was telling Dr. Lee that Union Carbide case is one unique case in which you have almost every single statement that you make that could be seen as libelous is actually can be substantiated with internal corporate documents that we happen to have. And this document shows that in 1989, Union Carbide scientists actually tested the groundwater before anyone else did. And they found that they could not get LD50 values through bioassay, the lethal dose 50 values of these chemicals in the groundwater, because they report in their test report that every dilution we tried, there was 100% fish mortality. And yet this information was suppressed. And lastly, Union Carbide, and this is a little tricky, I cannot go into detail because of lack of time, but essentially Union Carbide, after that settlement Anand was talking about, the disastrous settlement which cost the company only 43 cents per share, talk about deterrent compensation. This settlement was part of that settlement. When it was modified, Union Carbide was told by the court, you have to set up a hospital with 500 beds for long-term treatment of people. At the same time, it reinstated the criminal charges. And as a part of that, when their properties were confiscated, Union Carbide Corporation got the judge to disattach these confiscated shares and use that to build the hospital, and which again, this hospital is now at the center of that. Sarojini knows much more about that. This hospital was at the center of drug trials, at least 13 drug trials carried out by companies like Pfizer, Sanofi, Aventis, AstraZeneca on the Bhopal gas victims. So it continues. We think that the reason the impunity that Union Carbide got after killing 25,000 people is possibly encouraged the drug companies, saying what's a few more deaths if all these people who committed those crimes could get away, we could get away as well. So, as I said, the majority of the people who were affected were poor people, as it happens, and I've done a little traveling, and particularly done this special traveling to see toxic areas in other countries, in Europe and US, and everywhere it's the same story, which is if you are poor, if you are non-white, if you are somehow dispossessed of power, you find that you are close, you have a much greater risk of being exposed to environmental toxins. And this is the story repeatedly. This is the same story in Bhopal. So as I said, 72% people were those who were dependent upon hard physical labor, and being affected, losing the health meant starving and not being able to maintain your family. The same story is with the contaminated groundwater, because it is this area where people migrated to, people who could not afford to pay rent. They went because the place was vacant. They thought they could settle there, not knowing that the water that they were drinking was actually contaminated in this terrible way. But what is amazing is that this kind of having people who had hardly anything and who have had their physical powers being impacted because of the extreme exposure and by exposure to groundwater, it hasn't stopped people fighting for their rights and fighting for what they need most. And in fact, the Bhopal survivors' struggle is possibly the longest struggle of industrial victims anywhere in the world. And this has happened legally and extra legally. In the legal actions also, again, when the case was taken to the US federal court, Union Carbide Corporation said, we can't have it in the US court because the case belongs to India, because they're scared that a US court would make them pay heavy damages. And the Indian government's lawyer did argue that it is in all the decisions that led to the disaster, the decision of cutting costs, the decision of building the factory with mild steel instead of stainless steel, the decision to shut down the refrigeration system, which was stipulated in their own manuals just to cut cost, to save something like $35 a day, were all taken at Union Carbide's headquarters in Danbury, Connecticut. And that's why the US courts were the proper forum. But the US judge said, no, it's the Indian court that it will go to. And that's where, as Anand was telling, that's where the settlement occurred. So one was the legal action continues, and we tried to take our case, we tried to appeal to the International Court of Justice in Hague, and we are told, sorry, we don't deal with this, we don't deal with corporations, we just deal with matters brought up by two different nations. If it's the Indian government and the US government, we would have done it, but sorry, we can't do much. And what is interesting is that the judge who actually gave that settlement judgment, that same judge was promoted to the International Court of Justice the same year that the settlement was struck. And we know that Union Carbide Corporation had a role to play into getting that judge nominated and put into ICJ at $1 million a year. But as we are relating, the actions by the survivors have included fasts, have included walks, like twice walking from Bhopal to New Delhi, a distance of 750 kilometers, marches, occupations, including occupying Union Carbide's office here in Delhi, and sometimes campaign tours, sometimes tours in the US or in UK, or different parts of Asia. Also sometimes pranks. I'm told there are some people who stuck these stickers in local trains in Bombay saying, if you want to know whether you'll have your success in love or have tour foreign countries, get sons born to you, you should call these numbers. And those numbers actually are not astrologers but Dow Chemicals. And so they had to change their visiting cards. I'm told people did those things. But we did a lot of petitioning as well. I mean, we went to UN several times. We petitioned WHO, we petitioned UNEP. We went and met Mr. Jose Ocampo in the New York office of the UN. He promised us a lot, took 3 months of time to decide that what all he can deliver. We said, look, there's UNEP that can at least assess the contamination in and around the factory. We said there's ILO, there's large number of workers that are involved. We said UNICEF, children we find the next generation of children. We find, and this is research that was published in Journal of American Medical Association and the American Journal of Industrial Medicine, do something for the children. We said there are specific bodies in the United Nations that can actually do a lot of good. And we were promised by Mr. Ocampo, and then nothing happened. We went to Business and Human Rights section with the UNHCR, nothing happened. Promises were definitely made. So what we find is, in terms of challenges in terms of global governance is one is very key, and this even a child will understand, is that these transnational corporations, they operate everywhere, but yet they're some above the law of all these countries. There's no fora where the transnational corporations can be held accountable for their continuing crimes. We don't have it, and that's the other problem. Is that we find that organizations like Red Cross, international organizations, they rush when there is a natural disaster, when some act of God happens. But when there's some act of some corporation, it are nowhere. In the last 28 years, none of these international organizations actually have said that here's something that we can do. And why? Because the fingers would be pointed at named corporations. And that's the reason why they have avoided. So this itself is a challenge. Because Bhopal is not an isolated case. There are slow and silent Bhopals happening all over our country and all over the world, in fact. In fact, if you look into just this year, there's a global chemical report published by the UN, and they say that among the top 5 causes of death today, chemical deaths due to chemical exposure is among the top 5. And this is not just accidental exposures, because if you take either the occupational deaths of more than 2.1 million people, if you go by ILO data, or by the deaths because of environmental exposure or diseases because of environmental exposure, we are talking of a huge and continuing and all pervasive and ubiquitous but invisible corporate crimes. We do not have anything globally to hold corporations accountable for these crimes. And in terms, and we were also asked to talk about knowledge production, and I think in this is one area where this all can be seen most clearly. Because right from the beginning, like the cause of the disaster, right after the disaster, Union Carbide Corporation retained a consultancy company called R30 Little. And R30 Little did their research and did their visit and did their data analysis, and then made a solid case that it was in fact a disgruntled worker who caused the disaster. And this story changed. Right? The first story was not this. The first story was Union Carbide officials seems to have seen a poster in a Sikh temple somewhere in Punjab that the Punjabi Black September groups had caused this. The Black September story didn't sell because the poster they couldn't produce. So then it was the disgruntled worker by R30 Little story. Then it came out, maybe that is too uncharitable to the community of workers. So said maybe that worker did not actually want to cause the disaster, but he just mixed water into the tank and that ended up causing the disaster. At the same time, government scientific agencies like ICMR, I was telling how the study on next generation children born to gas exposed parents, that study was prematurely terminated. In fact, several studies were prematurely terminated because they were coming out with data that would have caused damage to Union Carbide Corporation and its present owner, the Dow Chemical Company. But in the face of all of that, survivors and supporter organizations have carried out a lot of research and generation of much data and publication of this data in international peer-reviewed research. In fact, I came here in the middle of an epidemiological study that we were carrying out, and this will be a pretty large study involving about more than 100,000 people from unexposed communities as well as people exposed to gas and contaminated groundwater. So the people of Bhopal and their supporters are committed to continue with this struggle till justice is done and the individuals and agencies are punished in an exemplary manner. Thank you.